Hello, everyone. It is great to have you here. Stay with me for a moment because what I am about to tell you is going to sound completely backward, counterintuitive, and maybe even absurd. We are watching a geopolitical drama unfold where the United States is threatening tariffs and considering military force to acquire Frozen Island, all under the banner of national security. But once you see the full picture, you will realize that China wants the U.S. to buy Greenland. Here is the paradox no one saw. While Washington thinks it is blocking Beijing, it is actually handing them a strategic victory. By obsessing over territory, we might be losing the real war for influence. The core argument being repeated in Congress and argued about in NATO headquarters is that we must take Greenland before China does. The narrative is that we need to secure it. We need to own it. Because if we do not, Beijing will move in and America will lose the Arctic forever. That is the story you're hearing on the news. That is what is sparking protests in the streets of Nuuk. But here is the part that should be keeping geopolitical strategists awake at night. China does not actually need Greenland. In fact, there is a very real possibility that Beijing is sitting back, watching this entire circus unfold and quietly celebrating. Every move the United States makes to acquire Greenland might actually be making China stronger. Let me show you why. First, let us understand the official reasoning. To be clear, some of it is legitimate. Greenland sits at one of the most strategically important locations on the planet. It is positioned right between North America and Europe, straddling what is called the GIUK Gap, the maritime passage connecting Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. During the Cold War, NATO forces used this passage to track Soviet submarines moving into the North Atlantic. Today, as Russian and Chinese naval activity increases in the Arctic, that monitoring capability matters more than ever. Greenland also hosts Patuxent Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base, a critical installation for American missile defense and space surveillance. The United States has maintained a military presence there since World War II under agreements with Denmark. It is part of America's early warning system against ballistic missile attacks. Then there are the resources. Greenland holds massive deposits of rare earth elements. These are the minerals essential for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to advanced weapon systems. The island has an estimated 1.5 million metric tons of rare earth reserves, including heavy rare earths like dysprosium and terbium that are particularly valuable for high-temperature magnets. China currently dominates the global rare earth market, controlling around 90% of processing. So the argument goes, if America controlled Greenland, we could break that Chinese monopoly. Finally, there's the Arctic itself. Climate change is opening new shipping routes through the Arctic Ocean. The Northern Sea Route, which follows Russia's northern coast, can cut transit time between Asia and Europe by up to 2 weeks compared to the traditional route through the Suez Canal. As ice continues to melt, projections suggest the Arctic could be navigable year-round within decades. Control over Arctic territory means control over these emerging trade corridors. All of this sounds reasonable on paper. Strategic location, military installations, critical minerals, shipping routes. It sounds like classic geopolitical chess. America secures Greenland, China loses access, and the problem is solved. Except that is not how it works. Not even close. Let us start with the rare earth argument because it is the one that sounds the most compelling. China controls the rare earth market, and Greenland has massive rare earth deposits. Therefore, America needs Greenland to break Chinese dominance. It sounds simple, right? It is wrong. Here is why. First, rare earths are not actually rare. The name is misleading. These minerals exist all over the world, including in the continental United States. According to the United States Geological Survey, American rare earth reserves stand at about 1.9 million metric tons. Greenland's estimated reserves are 1.5 million tons. America already has more. The issue is not finding rare earths. The issue is processing them. Extracting rare earth elements is incredibly difficult and environmentally toxic. For every ton of rare earths you mine, you generate about 2,000 tons of toxic waste. It is a dirty, expensive, complicated process that requires specialized facilities, strict environmental controls, and massive upfront investment. China does not dominate the rare earth market because they have all the minerals. They dominate because they built the processing infrastructure, accepted the environmental costs, and undercut competitors by subsidizing the industry for decades. It was a deliberate strategic decision that started back in the 1980s and 90s when Western countries decided processing rare earths was not worth the hassle. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Even if the United States acquired Greenland tomorrow and immediately started mining operations, which, by the way, would take at least a decade to get up and running, where do you think those raw materials would go? They would go to China for processing. Because China has the facilities, China has the expertise, and China has the supply chains. Building equivalent processing infrastructure in the United States or Greenland would require tens of billions of dollars and many years of development. Multiple industry experts have called the whole rare earth justification for Greenland absurd for exactly this reason. Mining Greenland does not change the strategic leverage Beijing holds because the minerals still need to go to Chinese facilities for refining. So the first pillar of the argument collapses under scrutiny. Acquiring Greenland does not solve the rare earth problem. It might not even help. Now, let us talk about the Arctic shipping routes because this is where the geography gets really important and where a lot of people seem to misunderstand the map. There are multiple potential routes through the Arctic. The two most discussed are the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. The Northern Sea Route follows the northern coastline of Russia, running from the Barents Sea in the west to the Bering Strait in the east. It is about 5,600 kilometers long and stays within Russian territorial waters for most of its length. The Northwest Passage, on the other hand, runs through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, passing north of Canada and Alaska. This route does come closer to the waters of Greenland. But here's the critical detail. China has invested heavily in the Northern Sea Route, not the Northwest Passage. In September of 2025, China successfully completed its first commercial container ship voyage along the Northern Sea Route with the vessel Istanbul Bridge. That journey took 26 days from China to Europe, about half the time it would take via the Suez Canal. China calls this the Polar Silk Road and has signed extensive cooperation agreements with Russia to develop it. Russia controls the Northern Sea Route. Russia charges fees for passage. Russia provides icebreaker escorts, and Russia sets the rules. China has accepted this arrangement because it serves their interests. The route cuts straight across the top of Siberia, nowhere near Greenland. Even if the United States owned Greenland outright, it would not give Washington any meaningful control over the shipping route China actually cares about. The Northwest Passage through Canadian waters would still be primarily a Canadian jurisdiction issue, and Canada is already a NATO ally. So acquiring Greenland does not block the Arctic ambitions of Beijing in any practical sense. The routes they are developing do not go through Greenlandic waters. The infrastructure they are building is in partnership with Russia, not Denmark. This is like saying you need to buy the house of your neighbor to prevent someone from using the highway 3 blocks over. The logic simply does not connect. Let me be clear about what the real interests of China and Greenland have been. Chinese companies have tried to invest in mining projects there. Shanghai Resources, a Chinese rare earth company, became the second largest shareholder in the Kvanefjeld mine project in southern Greenland. That project was supposed to become one of the world's largest rare earth and uranium mines. But here's what happened. The Parliament of Greenland passed legislation in 2021 prohibiting uranium mining, which effectively killed the project because uranium and rare earths occur together in that deposit. The Chinese investment was blocked not by American military force, not by diplomatic pressure in the traditional sense, but by local environmental regulations and democratic decision-making within the government of Greenland. Chinese investors also tried to buy the Tanbreeze mining project. Officials from the United States reportedly lobbied hard to prevent that sale, and eventually the project was sold to an American company, Critical Metals Corporation, for reportedly much less than Chinese firms had offered. So Chinese attempts to gain direct access to the mineral wealth of Greenland have already been thwarted through diplomatic and economic means, not military ones. And these measures were achieved while Greenland remained a Danish territory and a NATO ally. The pattern here is important. The autonomy of Greenland and its relationship with democratic Western institutions have been effective barriers to unwanted Chinese influence. Local opposition to large-scale mining, environmental concerns, and NATO security considerations have all worked to limit Chinese penetration. None of this required the United States to threaten tariffs, alienate European allies, or contemplate military force. The system was working. Now let us talk about what happens if the U.S. takes Greenland. This is where we get to the paradox. The question isn't whether acquiring Greenland would benefit America. The question is whether it would benefit China. And the answer, I'm about to argue, is yes, potentially enormously. Let us walk through what is actually happening right now in real time as this acquisition strategy is pursued. First, NATO is fracturing. The Danish Prime Minister has stated bluntly that if the United States attacks Greenland, it would mean the end of NATO. European leaders have issued joint statements expressing alarm. 8 countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, are now facing tariff threats from the US unless they support the acquisition of Greenland. Think about what this means for China. For decades, one of the strategic challenges for Beijing has been the cohesion of NATO. The alliance represents the combined military and economic power of the United States and Europe, working in coordination. It is a massive obstacle to Chinese ambitions in multiple regions. China has struggled to drive wedges between America and Europe, to create divisions, and to weaken the effectiveness of the alliance. And now, the United States is doing it for them, by threatening allies, by imposing tariffs on partners, By suggesting military force against a NATO member's territory, Washington is accomplishing what Xi Jinping never could. They are turning the closest allies of America into adversaries. Every European defense minister now has to explain to their parliament why they should continue trusting American security guarantees. Every German business leader is wondering if economic ties with the US are reliable. Every French voter is questioning whether NATO serves their interests. That is strategic gold for China. Second, this Greenland saga is consuming enormous American political capital and attention. Congress is debating it, the White House is focused on it, defense officials are planning for it, diplomats are managing the fallout, media coverage is dominated by it. Meanwhile, what is happening in the South China Sea? What is the status of Taiwan? What about Chinese influence operations in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia? What about the technological advances in Beijing, their military modernization, their strategic partnerships? The more time and energy America spends on Greenland, the less focus there is on issues that actually threaten Chinese interests. It is a massive distraction wrapped in a national security justification. Third, let us talk about money. Estimates for purchasing Greenland range from $500 billion to $700 billion. Even the low end of that range represents an astronomical cost. For context, the entire annual U.S. defense budget is around $800 billion. Where does that money go? To Denmark, presumably. And what does it not go toward? Everything else. Infrastructure in the United States, shipbuilding for the Navy, hypersonic missile development, cyber defense capabilities, semiconductor manufacturing, all the actual tools of strategic competition with China. Even if Greenland were free, the cost of developing it would be staggering. The infrastructure barely exists. There are no rail lines connecting mining sites to ports, no deep-water facilities capable of handling large commercial vessels in most locations, no power grid sufficient for industrial-scale operations. Building all of that in Arctic conditions on mountainous terrain with limited labor pools would cost hundreds of billions more. That is money not spent countering China where it matters. Fourth, and this might be the most important point, acquiring Greenland through intimidation, threats, or force fundamentally undermines the soft power advantage of America. One of the key differences between the United States and China on the global stage has been that America is seen as a defender of international law, sovereignty, and a rules-based order, while China is increasingly viewed as an aggressive, expansionist power willing to ignore international norms when convenient. That perception matters. It is why countries in Southeast Asia seek American military partnerships, even while maintaining economic ties with China. It is why European nations, despite economic dependence on Chinese trade, align with American strategic priorities. It is why smaller nations trust American security commitments. But what happens when the United States threatens military action against the territory of an allied democracy? When Washington imposes economic coercion to force territorial transfers? When an American president suggests that might makes right in international affairs? The narrative flips. Suddenly, China can point to American behavior and say, see, they are no different than us. They claim to support sovereignty and international law, but only when it suits them. Beijing has already started making exactly this argument. Chinese state media has been highlighting the hypocrisy. America condemns Chinese actions in the South China Sea while threatening to seize Allied territory in the Arctic. Every country watching this situation is recalculating. If the United States is willing to pressure Denmark, a loyal NATO ally, what does that mean for other partners? Can American security commitments be trusted? Are there limits to how far Washington will go? Here is another layer most analysis misses: the Greenland independence paradox. Greenland is pursuing independence. The island has been self-governing since 2009 with the right to declare independence through a referendum. Independence from Denmark is a major political issue within Greenland. If Greenland becomes independent while remaining aligned with the West, it is actually a better outcome for American interests than annexation. An independent Greenland could maintain close security cooperation with the United States through bilateral agreements similar to what the U.S. has with many Pacific Island nations. It could host American military installations. It could coordinate on Arctic security. And it could do all of this while maintaining legitimacy in international forums. But aggressive approaches are poisoning that possibility. Greenlanders are not interested in becoming Americans. Polls show overwhelming opposition to U.S. acquisition. Protests in Nuuk have featured signs explicitly rejecting American control. The Premier of Greenland has stated unequivocally that Greenland belongs to its people and is not for sale. The more pressure the United States applies, the more Greenlanders will resist any form of American involvement, even cooperative partnerships, that would genuinely serve the interests of both parties. And if the path to independence for Greenland becomes complicated by American antagonism, if the process gets delayed or derailed, who benefits? Potentially China. Because an unsettled, disputed status for Greenland creates exactly the kind of ambiguity that Beijing can exploit. not through direct control, but through economic influence, through supporting independence movements as a counterweight to American pressure, through offering investment that desperate governments might accept. Imagine you are a strategic planner in Beijing. You have been working for years to counter American influence in the Arctic. You have been trying to weaken NATO. You have been attempting to distract Washington from your activities in Asia. You have been building narratives about American imperialism to undermine U.S. soft power globally. And then the United States announces it wants to buy Greenland. Better yet, threats of military force are made. Even better, tariffs are imposed on European allies who resist. The European Union is now in emergency meetings discussing how to respond to threats from their supposed protector. The Prime Minister of Denmark is warning about the end of NATO. German, French, and British officials are questioning American reliability. Do you intervene? Do you try to stop it? Or do you sit back and let it happen? From the perspective of Beijing, pursuing Greenland accomplishes multiple strategic objectives without China having to lift a finger. The Atlantic Alliance is fracturing. American resources and attention are diverted. The rules-based international order that constrains Chinese behavior is being undermined by American actions. The reputation of Washington as a trustworthy partner is crumbling in real time. Why would China want to prevent that? In fact, there's a case to be made that China should be actively encouraging it, though of course they would never say so publicly. Behind closed doors, Chinese officials might be thrilled. Every day this drags on, every escalation, every tariff threat, every strained diplomatic exchange serves the interests of Beijing. Let us zoom in on the specific tactical errors and how this is being handled, because they make the strategic problem even worse. The Greenland acquisition has been framed as an ultimatum backed by economic coercion and potential military force. That approach guarantees failure while maximizing damage. Denmark is a wealthy, stable democracy with strong institutions and rule of law. It is not a desperate failed state. You cannot simply apply pressure and expect capitulation. Danish public opinion is overwhelmingly against selling Greenland. The Danish parliament would never approve it. King Frederick X has publicly affirmed Greenland as part of the Danish realm. Even if you could somehow force a transaction, Greenland itself has to agree. And Greenlanders have made their position crystal clear. They do not want to be purchased. They do not want to become Americans. The autonomy they have gained from Denmark is leading toward independence, not toward a different colonial relationship. So the end result is that Washington is burning bridges with European allies, alienating Greenland, spending massive political capital, and still not achieving the stated objective. It is all cost, no benefit. Meanwhile, China is taking notes. They are watching how the U.S. treats its partners. They are watching how easily the Atlantic Alliance can be disrupted. They are watching American strategic attention get consumed by a territorial dispute with a NATO ally. And they are adjusting their own strategies accordingly. Here is what is particularly frustrating about this entire situation. There was and still is a pathway for the United States to secure its interests in Greenland without any of this chaos. The United States already has a military presence at Patuxent Space Base. That presence could be expanded through negotiations with Denmark and Greenland. The base could be upgraded. Additional facilities could be built, all with the consent and cooperation of both governments. American companies can already invest in the mining sector of Greenland. The Greenland government has been actively seeking Western investment to develop its resources and infrastructure. They want partnerships with democratic allies. An American mining company, Critical Metals, already owns the Tanbreeze Rare Earth Project. The U.S. Export-Import Bank is considering a $120 million loan to fund it. All of this happened through normal economic channels. Greenland needs investment to achieve independence from the subsidies of Denmark. Denmark sends about $600 million annually to Greenland, covering roughly half the budget of the island. Mining, tourism, and other industries need development. That requires capital, technical expertise, and infrastructure. The United States could have been the partner of Greenland in that development. Washington could have offered comprehensive investment packages, technical assistance, infrastructure development, and security cooperation, all framed as supporting the democratic governance and eventual independence of Greenland. That approach would have secured American interests, countered Chinese influence through positive engagement rather than threats, strengthened the Atlantic Alliance, and maintained the reputation of America as a supporter of sovereignty and democracy. Instead, we got tariffs, threats, and talk of military force. This is not just about Greenland. It is about a pattern in how American foreign policy conceptualizes power in competition with China. There is an assumption that every geopolitical issue is zero-sum, that territory equals power, and that acquisition and control are the primary tools of statecraft. It is a 19th century view of international relations applied to 21st century challenges. Modern strategic competition does not work that way. The influence of China in Africa is not built on owning African territory. It is built on investments, infrastructure projects, trade relationships, and diplomatic engagement. The Belt and Road Initiative is not about colonizing countries. It is about creating dependencies, shaping preferences, and building influence through economic integration. China understands that in the contemporary world, you do not need to own Greenland to benefit from its resources. You just need access, which can be secured through contracts, investments, and relationships with whoever does control the territory. Meanwhile, the United States is threatening a military takeover which would be illegal under international law, would violate the founding principles of NATO, and would accomplish little, even if successful, because the practical challenges of developing Greenland would remain unchanged. So, where does this leave us? What happens next? Several scenarios are possible, none of them good for American interests. First scenario, the administration continues pursuing Greenland aggressively. Relations with European allies deteriorate further. NATO's cohesion weakens, and China capitalizes on the division. America either succeeds in acquiring Greenland at enormous financial and diplomatic cost, gaining little strategic value, or fails after burning all that political capital. Either way, Beijing wins. Second scenario, the administration backs down from the Greenland push, but the damage is already done. European allies have been alienated. Trust has been broken. The perception of American foreign policy as erratic and unreliable solidifies. Again, China benefits from the reduced confidence in U.S. partnerships. Third scenario, some kind of middle ground solution emerges, perhaps an expanded security agreement or investment partnership that does not involve a transfer of sovereignty. But given how confrontational the initial approach has been, even reaching that outcome would require significant diplomatic repair work and might not restore the status quo ante. In all three scenarios, China comes out ahead relative to where they were before Washington started talking about Greenland. That is the paradox. The harder the United States pushes to acquire Greenland specifically to counter China, the more it actually advantages the strategic position of China. There is an even more troubling dimension to consider. China is learning lessons from how this plays out. They are studying how the international system responds to aggressive territorial claims by a major power. They are watching whether NATO can maintain unity when challenged by one of its own members. They are observing whether international law and norms provide any real constraint on great power behavior. If the United States can threaten to seize Allied territory and face minimal consequences, what does that signal about how China might pursue its own territorial claims? If Washington can impose economic coercion to force territorial changes, why can't Beijing? Every norm that gets eroded, every principle that gets violated, every alliance that gets weakened makes the job easier for China when it comes to Taiwan, the South China Sea, or its border disputes with India and other neighbors. The precedent being set here extends far beyond the Arctic. Let me bring this down from geopolitical abstractions for a moment, because this affects ordinary Americans and Europeans in concrete ways. When NATO allies turn against each other, security becomes less predictable. When the United States alienates partners, those partners start hedging their bets. European countries might decide they need independent military capabilities because American commitments cannot be trusted. That means they spend their money on their own defense rather than coordinating with U.S. forces. It also means economic disruption. Tariffs on European goods raise prices for American consumers. Trade wars reduce economic growth. Uncertainty makes businesses hesitant to invest. These are not abstract diplomatic squabbles. They show up in your costs, your job security, and your retirement accounts. And when China gains strategic advantages, that has implications for everything from technology standards to supply chain security to the military balance in the Pacific. A stronger China relative to the United States means more American resources devoted to military competition, more risk of conflict, and more pressure on allies like Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. None of this benefits ordinary citizens. Not in America, not in Europe, not anywhere except possibly in Beijing. Here's what is tragic about this situation. There was a version of events where the United States could have genuinely countered Chinese influence in the Arctic, strengthened the Atlantic Alliance, and secured American interests. That version involved patient diplomacy, investment partnerships, security cooperation, supporting the democratic development and eventual independence of Greenland, and working through NATO to coordinate Arctic strategy. It involved helping European allies build their own capabilities to monitor and respond to Russian and Chinese activities in the region. It involved recognizing that modern strategic competition is not about territorial conquest. It is about influence, partnerships, and the ability to shape outcomes through positive engagement. It involved understanding that the greatest advantage America has over China is not raw power. It is the attractiveness of the American model, the strength of democratic alliances, and the credibility of commitments to international law and sovereignty. All of those advantages are being squandered in pursuit of a goal, acquiring Greenland, that would not even accomplish its stated purpose of countering China. Here's the bottom line, the uncomfortable truth that needs to be said clearly. If you wanted to design a policy that would benefit China while claiming to counter China, you would struggle to do better than the current Greenland strategy. Fracture NATO? Check. Distract American attention from Asia? Check. Undermine faith in American partnerships? Check. Damage U.S. soft power and moral authority? Check. Waste enormous resources on symbolic territorial acquisition? Check. Create precedents that justify Chinese territorial aggression? Check. China does not need to invest in Greenland if the United States is doing the strategic work of Beijing for them. This does not mean there are no legitimate concerns about the Arctic, or about Chinese activities there, or about ensuring that Greenland remains aligned with Western interests. Those concerns are real, but the way to address them is not through threats, coercion, and unilateral action against allies. That approach is precisely backward. It achieves the opposite of what it claims to pursue. If I were advising a president who genuinely wanted to counter Chinese influence in the Arctic and secure American interests, here's what I would recommend. 1. Dramatically increase investment in American rare earth processing capabilities. If the dominance of that sector by China is the real concern, address it directly. Subsidize domestic processing. Offer incentives for companies to build facilities. Partner with allies like Australia, Canada, and European nations to create alternative supply chains. This is less dramatic than trying to buy Greenland, but it would actually solve the problem. 2. Propose a comprehensive Arctic partnership agreement with Nordic allies, bringing together the United States, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland to coordinate on security, environmental protection, and economic development. Make it attractive for Greenland to participate as either a Danish territory or eventually as an independent nation. 3. Offer Greenland a major investment package focused on infrastructure, renewable energy, telecommunications, and sustainable development. Make it clear that this comes with no strings attached regarding sovereignty. Position the United States as a partner in the future of Greenland rather than a would-be owner. 4. Strengthen the existing security relationship, upgrade Patuxent Space Base, propose joint exercises in Arctic environments, and offer to help Denmark and Greenland develop their own Arctic monitoring capabilities, all with their full consent and cooperation. 5. Build a coalition specifically focused on rare earth supply chain diversification. Work with allies to develop multiple mining and processing sites globally, reducing dependence on any single source, including China. 6. Support the eventual independence of Greenland through diplomatic recognition and economic assistance. Framed as backing democratic self-determination, an independent Greenland aligned with Western interests serves American objectives better than a coerced annexation. None of these approaches makes for dramatic cable news coverage. They do not involve threats or ultimatums. They require patience and sustained commitment rather than grand gestures. But they would actually work. They would genuinely counter Chinese influence. They would strengthen alliances rather than destroying them. And they would not hand Beijing the strategic gift of a fractured NATO. This whole saga raises a fundamental question about American foreign policy in the era of great power competition. Does the United States understand what competition with China actually requires? It is not about territorial acquisition. It is not about displays of dominance. It is not about unilateral action and the imposition of American will. It is about building and maintaining coalitions. It is about demonstrating the superiority of democratic governance and market economics. It is about being a reliable partner. It is about long-term strategic thinking rather than short-term wins. China is playing a patient game. They are building relationships over decades. They are making investments that will not pay off for years. They are willing to accept short-term costs for long-term positioning. The Belt and Road Initiative did not start showing returns immediately. The patient cultivation of relationships by China and Africa took decades to bear fruit. Their technological advancement came from sustained investment in education and research and development, not quick fixes. Meanwhile, American policy increasingly operates on news cycles, grand pronouncements, dramatic gestures, threats, and ultimatums designed for domestic political consumption rather than strategic effectiveness. That approach will not win a long-term competition with China. It will not counter the patient strategy of Beijing, and it certainly will not secure American interests in the Arctic or anywhere else. Look, I know Greenland can seem like a remote issue, a frozen island most people could not find on a map, a diplomatic dispute that does not affect daily life. But this story matters because it reveals something crucial about how power works in the modern world, about what makes countries secure, about how strategic competition actually plays out. The paradox of the Greenland situation, that trying to acquire it to counter China might actually benefit China, is not just about this one island or this one policy. It is a window into a deeper problem in how American foreign policy is being conducted. When you threaten allies to prevent adversaries from gaining influence, you hand those adversaries exactly what they want. When you undermine the very alliances that form the foundation of your strategic position, you weaken yourself far more than any external rival could. When you spend hundreds of billions of dollars in massive political capital on symbolic territorial acquisition that does not address the underlying strategic challenges, you are not being strong, you are being distracted. China does not need to fight the United States directly. If Washington is willing to divide itself from its allies, undermine its own credibility, and exhaust its resources on quixotic pursuits, Beijing just needs to watch. The Greenland saga is teaching China that they do not need complex strategies to weaken the global position of America. So what happens now? As I am recording this, the situation is still unfolding. Tariffs have been announced. European allies are coordinating responses. Denmark is increasing defense spending in Greenland. The NATO Secretary General is trying to prevent a complete alliance breakdown. The outcome is not certain. Maybe cooler heads will prevail. Maybe some face-saving compromise will emerge. Maybe the whole thing will quietly fade away. But the damage has been done. Trust has been broken. Allies are questioning American reliability. China is watching and learning. The question is whether Washington will recognize the counterproductive nature of this approach and change course, or whether the commitment to the narrative that we must own Greenland to stop China will override strategic reality. Because here is what should be obvious by now. The narrative is wrong. Owning Greenland would not stop China. The routes Beijing cares about do not go through Greenland. The processing capabilities that matter are in China, regardless of where you mine the ore. The strategic competition that counts is about influence and partnerships, not territorial control. Meanwhile, the pursuit of Greenland is accomplishing what Chinese strategists could only dream of: dividing NATO, distracting American focus, undermining democratic norms, and damaging American credibility. If Beijing had the power to design American foreign policy to serve Chinese interests, they could not do much better than what is currently being implemented. That is the paradox. That is what nobody is talking about. And before we close, there's one final critical dimension to this paradox that we have not touched on yet, and it might be the most dangerous oversight of all. It involves the specific military reality on the ice and the relationship between Beijing and Moscow. While Washington is focused on buying the land, they are ignoring the fact that they cannot actually sail the waters. This brings us to what military experts call the icebreaker gap. You cannot project power in the Arctic if you cannot physically move through it. As of right now, the United States Coast Guard has exactly two operational major icebreakers: the heavy icebreaker Polar Star, which is over 40 years old and prone to mechanical fires, and the medium icebreaker Healy. That is the entire surface fleet capable of sustained Arctic operations. Compare that to Russia. Moscow operates a fleet of over 40 icebreakers, including nuclear-powered Leviathans that can smash through the thickest multi-year ice without refueling for months. They are building more. They have the infrastructure, the ports, the search and rescue capabilities, and the logistical network to dominate the region physically. And China? Despite being a near-Arctic state with no Arctic coastline, China has built two heavy icebreakers, the Shillong and Shillong II, and is constructing a third. They are rapidly building the capability to be there, while the United States is arguing over a real estate deed. Here's the irony. Even if the United States bought Greenland tomorrow, it would still lack the maritime capability to patrol the waters, support commercial traffic, or conduct large-scale search and rescue operations around the island. Owning the territory does not magically conjure the fleet needed to secure it. That requires years of shipbuilding, training, and investment, things that have been neglected for decades. By focusing on the acquisition of land rather than the construction of ships, Washington is prioritizing the appearance of power over the substance of it. It is like buying a parking lot when you do not own a car, and then claiming you have solved your transportation problem. But the danger goes beyond just hardware. It is about the diplomatic vacuum we are creating. For years, one of the quiet goals of Western Arctic strategy was to keep Russia and China from forming a unified bloc in the high north. Russia has historically been wary of Chinese intrusion into the Arctic. They view the Northern Sea Route as their national waterway, and have been hesitant to let Beijing gain too much of a foothold. But the aggressive posture of the United States regarding Greenland and the alienation of European allies is pushing Moscow and Beijing into each other as arms. When the U.S. disrupts the Arctic Council, the primary forum for cooperation in the region, and threatens NATO allies, we isolate ourselves. We leave Russia with fewer options for economic development and security cooperation. If Russia cannot work with the West because of sanctions and diplomatic rifts, and if the Arctic Council becomes paralyzed by U.S. unilateralism, Moscow has only one direction to turn: south, to Beijing. We are seeing this happen in real time. The Polar Silk Road is moving from a concept to a concrete alliance. Russian energy projects in the Arctic are increasingly funded by Chinese capital. Chinese shipping companies are getting preferential access to Russian icebreaker escorts. Joint naval patrols are becoming more common. By acting aggressively to stop China, the United States is actually catalyzing the formation of a Sino-Russian Arctic axis that combines Russian geography and icebreaking capability with Chinese capital and market demand. This is a nightmare scenario for Western strategists. A unified Russia-China front in the Arctic is infinitely harder to manage than two separate competitors with divergent interests. We are actively removing the wedges that existed between them and replacing them with a shared incentive to counter American unpredictability. So, the paradox deepens. Not only does buying Greenland fail to solve the rare earth or shipping route issues, but the very attempt to do so exposes our lack of physical capability, the icebreaker gap, and drives our two primary competitors into a tighter strategic embrace. We are trading actual alliances with democratic partners for fantasy of territorial control, while our adversaries are building the real ships and the real partnerships that will define the future of the region. That is why this matters. Let me leave you with this thought. Strategy is not about good intentions. It is not about tough rhetoric or grand pronouncements. It is about whether your actions actually achieve your stated objectives. If your goal is to counter Chinese influence in the Arctic, and the result is a fractured NATO, alienated allies, wasted resources, and damaged credibility, then your strategy has failed, regardless of how forceful you sound. If your goal is to secure rare earth supplies, and your approach does not actually solve the processing problem, then you have missed the point. If your goal is to prevent China from gaining Arctic access, and the route they are developing does not go through the territory you're trying to acquire, then you are not even playing the same game. The United States has genuine strategic challenges in competing with China. The Arctic is genuinely important. Greenland is genuinely situated at a critical location. Rare earths genuinely matter. But the way to address these challenges is not through coercion, threats, and unilateral territorial acquisition. That approach serves Chinese interests while undermining American ones. Sometimes the hardest thing in strategy is recognizing when your actions contradict your goals, when you're so committed to a particular approach that you cannot see how it is backfiring, when the story you are telling yourself prevents you from seeing the actual dynamics at play. The Greenland situation is one of those moments. The United States is pursuing a policy that claims to counter China while potentially doing the work of Beijing for them. That is the paradox. That is the story almost nobody is telling. And that is why this matters far beyond one frozen island in the Arctic. Thank you for watching.